We are delighted to be here. Both of us have been in this venue in the past, and it's always a great opportunity to come back, especially for us at this moment. We have been out on the road for the better part of 2 months now promoting this book. We started out in New York City, where we both live, and made our way west, and we're in Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then swept across the country. Ended up a couple nights ago in Manchester, New Hampshire. And now we're back in New York City for what is the last, really the last night, the last big event that we're doing before Christmas with Double Down. And there is no place we would rather be to do that than here in New York City, because we love New York City. I promise I've not said that in any other city we've been in. But in this case, actually, I really, in fact, mean it. So, we're going to talk for a few minutes. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. Mark's going to talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to take questions. We like to save a lot of time for that, so please write down your questions on those cards that they have out there, and we promise we'll answer them unless we think they're too stupid to respond to. I doubt in this audience that anything will fall into that category. You guys are all incredibly incisive and astute analysts of politics and American affairs. As I say, we have had an incredible time over the last month and a half talking about the book. Many people have said really nice things about it. This event is one of many high points, but I will say that as great as this event promises to be, there's no way that it can rival the best thing that's happened to us over the course of the last 8 or 9 weeks, which is the endorsement of Double Down by the North Korean government. You laugh when I say that, but it's actually true. A few weeks ago, a Google News alert showed up in my inbox, and I thought North Korea and Double Down doesn't make any sense. I looked at it and went straight to the Washington Post, where there was a headline which read, "North Korea endorses Double Down as proof that, quote, the U.S. is the root cause of all sorts of evils." There's almost nothing that you could want more than that for a book that you've written. That's going straight on the back of the paperback for sure. In the world of book clubs, there's the Oprah Book Club and the Kim Jong-un Book Club. They're the only rivals for power and authority. And as we learned the other day when Kim Jong-un administered some rough justice to his uncle, he's a tough critic. So we're happy to have come out on the better end of his judgments. We wrote this book. It's the follow-up to our last book, a book called Game Change about the 2008 election. That book was subtitled Obama, the Clintons, McCain, and Palin in the Race of a Lifetime. You set yourself a sort of difficult challenge when you subtitle a book The Race of a Lifetime and then presume to write another book, because people ask, well, you've already done The Race of a Lifetime, how are you how's this going to measure up? People asked all along the way how we could equal that book in the sense of the story that we were going to have to tell. The 2008 election was a really dramatic election, and people often pointed out to us how much drama there was in that election. Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama's rise, the John Edwards, Sarah Palin, John McCain. And we would sometimes glibly sort of say that their drama is all well and good, but there's also another kind of narrative that you can tell, which is not a dramatic narrative, but a comedic narrative. There's comedy as well as drama. And in 2012, there was, to be sure, a lot of comedy, especially on the Republican side. You will recall Herman Cain speaking of Becky, Stan. Michelle Bachmann mistaking the hometown of John Wayne and the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Newt Gingrich finishing his epic political career by taking a tour of the nation's zoos and being bitten by a penguin. And even the characters that are not particularly funny in Double Down occasionally provide laughs that you'll see if you read the book. One of my favorite things in the book relates to two of the least funny characters in the 2012 race, Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum. Not very funny guys at all. But there's a point in the book where John McCain, in rendering his endorsement, deciding which of the state of the race where it was at that point, it was really down to Santorum versus Romney. And when McCain decided that he was going to endorse Romney, he told the governor that he had made his decision. He looked at it and said, the choice comes down to the dog on roof guy or the man on dog guy. And so I'm going to go with the dog on roof guy, which I think is not a bad line, by and large. There's a lot of drama also in Double Down, and the drama comes from, I think, more than anything, the stakes of the election. As much as having an incumbent run for re-election, is not as wild open and wild and woolly an affair as a race where there is no incumbent. This race had enormous consequences for the country. President Obama, we report in the book, on election night told his aides that this race meant more to him than the 2008 race. As historic as the 2008 race was, he felt as though this race was not about voters kind of voting on a dream or on a promise. It was voters rendering judgment on what he'd actually done in office. And so he felt as though he was going to get some kind of a validation for the big things that he'd done, big controversial things that he'd done in office, and hopefully a mandate to do more big things over the course of the next 4 years. He also felt as though there was a huge amount at stake in the sense that if he lost in 2012, Governor Romney, becoming President Romney with the help of a Republican Congress, were likely to dismantle much of what he'd achieved over the course of the past 4 years. He thought that would be a horrible thing for the country, and it would also kind of render his first term an accident of history in some ways. And so he felt as though he was fighting for very, very big stakes. And if you compare the two races, 2008 and 2012, the other thing that's true is that in 2008, Republicans were pretty dispirited in 2008. They had, after eight years of George W. Bush, a lot of Republicans were open even to considering a Democrat. A fair number of Republicans did in fact vote for Barack Obama. And by the time you got to election day, there was really no suspense. After the financial crisis, after Sarah Palin, Barack Obama's election was more or less certain because the Republican Party was pretty demoralized. In 2012, the Republican Party was very energized and really felt as though they had a chance to win the White House and put a lot of effort and spent a lot of money to try to get rid of Barack Obama. And so the fact of a very energized Democratic Party and a very energized Republican Party gave us a lot to work with in terms of suspense and in terms of drama and in terms of high historic consequence. I said I was going to talk for a few minutes. I'm going to tell one story or give you one story arc from the book before handing over to Mark, and he'll talk a little bit about how we do these books and a few other things. The story that I'll tell you, which is one of our favorite kind of narrative arcs in the book, and I'll just highlight some of the things in it for you, is a narrative arc that has drama and comedy and consequence and profanity. So you would guess almost certainly right off the top of your head it's got to involve the Clintons. And indeed it does. The first book in 2008, the book we wrote, Game Change, was really in some ways in our minds the love story of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And we would say that kind of, again, sort of glibly, but it really was true. And it was a classic love story. Boy meets girl, girl meets boy. They kind of like each other, develop a little crush on each other, and then spend 2 years trying to beat the hell out of each other, and then end up getting married, politically married at the end when Secretary Clinton became Secretary of State for Barack Obama. This book, in some sense, is another kind of love story, an equally kind of improbable love story. It's the love story of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. And that love story, as I say, is even more improbable in some ways than the first one because of the nature of the relationship between the two. Barack Obama and Bill Clinton really didn't have a relationship coming out of 2008. President Clinton had behaved in some pretty controversial ways in 2008. There was no love lost. Even after Hillary Clinton had joined the administration, there was no real love lost between the current president and the former one. President Clinton had a lot of advice and a lot of opinions, felt very strongly, as he said to a lot of friends, that Barack Obama did all the hard things very well, but the easy things not at all. And he wanted to try to get that advice across, but he was not getting a lot of phone calls from Barack Obama over the course of the first 3 years, mainly because President Obama wasn't really harboring any bad feelings or negative thoughts about President Clinton from 2008, but just because Barack Obama generally doesn't really call much of anyone. He's not someone who reaches out a lot. And he really didn't feel as though he needed President Clinton. He was getting big things done in the course of the first 2 years of the administration. They were controversial things. Again, healthcare was very controversial, the stimulus controversial, bailout of the auto industry, re-regulation of Wall Street. Those are big, controversial things. But President Obama didn't feel as though he really needed help. He was doing great. But then a couple big things happened. One was the midterm elections in 2010, and then the debt ceiling imbroglio over the summer of 2011, which left President Obama at his lowest place politically to that point in his presidency. He was down near 40% in the polls. 2/3 of the country thought the country was on the wrong track. The economy was still stuck in slow gear. The unemployment rate was well over 8%. And in the fall of 2011, most of President Obama's aides felt as though the president was no better than a 50-50 chance at re-election. Many of his advisors thought he was an underdog. President Obama said to one of his aides that he felt when he assessed his own situation, he felt like he was in deep shit. And at that moment, he felt as though he was willing to do something he would normally never countenance, which was not just to reach out, but to reach out to Bill Clinton. And so the courtship that began in the fall of 2011 and carried all the way through to Election Day is really a very fascinating story. It began, as many courtships do among men, on a golf course. And the golf course in question was at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. President Clinton, you know, is a big golfer. President Obama, you know, is a big golfer. They have very different attitudes towards golf, however. President Obama's attitude towards golf is very Obaman, which is to say he wants to play the game, he wants to get up and down 2.5 hours, finish the thing off, get back to work. He's on a tight schedule, he's got a lot to do. He wants to get in and out, get it done, get back to work. President Clinton has a different attitude towards golf. He is, to start with, he's a retiree, as you know. And like most retirees, he regards a golf game as an opportunity for things other than golf. He not only, everybody knows Bill Clinton takes a lot of mulligans, but when he's on the golf course, he also likes to extemporize and expostulate and express himself in a variety of ways. And so when President Obama and President Clinton played golf in the fall of 2011, that game did not take 2.5 hours. It took like 4.5 hours, and they didn't finish 18 holes. And President Obama was a little frustrated, and when he came off the links, one of his aides asked him how it went, how he felt about President Clinton, and he said, "I like President Clinton, in doses." That is not the best way for a love story to start, but things got better. And over the course of that next year, President Obama came to see President Clinton giving speeches in private at fundraisers, where he would extol President Obama's virtues and his record, what he'd accomplished, to make the case for why the American people should give him another 4 years. And he made this case in detail and in a compelling way, in an emotional way. And President Obama was really struck by it. He'd never heard President Clinton talk about him that way. And when he heard it, he would say to his aides, that's kind of great, the things he's saying about me. And hearing those private speeches gave him the idea of putting President Clinton on stage at the Democratic National Convention, which you all remember in Charlotte, the great speech President Clinton gave. There were 3 nights of that convention, one night dominated by Michelle Obama, one by Barack Obama, and the middle night should have been, by all rights, given over to Joe Biden. Certainly Joe Biden thought it should have been given to Joe Biden. But President Obama decided he was going to give that job to President Clinton and let him be the main person who would make the case for President Obama's record and dismantle the Republicans and carry all that big political load. And of course, he did it magnificently. Most people agree, even people who are Republicans, even people who don't like President Clinton, acknowledged it was a great speech. And President Clinton really took the opportunity. This was a benefit to President Obama because of President Clinton giving the great speech and validating President Obama's economic policies. For President Clinton, it was a big moment too. He had sort of been denigrated to some extent after 2008. A lot of people said he had kind of lost his fastball, that he couldn't really play at a high level of politics anymore. To get out there on that stage and give that hour-plus long speech and have it be judged a masterwork by everybody really helped to rehabilitate Bill Clinton's political image and his reputation, and he took a lot of pleasure in that. By the end of the campaign, the two of them had campaigned a fair amount together. They'd fundraised together. They'd been all over the place together. On the night, the eve of the storm, Superstorm Sandy, they were down together in Florida. And they were going to do an event the next morning. President Obama had to go back to Washington because the storm was bearing down on the eastern seaboard, and it looked like it was going to be a big deal. So he had to take off. And President Clinton said to President Obama, you go do that. You go be president. I'll pick up the slack. And over the course of the next week, President Clinton campaigned like crazy across the country. While President Obama was pinned down, President Clinton was coast to coast, doing 4, 5, 6 events every day, just asking for more, to great effect, really being kind of like President Obama's super surrogate around the country, campaigning as if his own name were on the ballot. On election night, to give you a sense of how far they traveled over the course of the year, on election night, after Mitt Romney called President Obama to concede, the first phone call President Obama made immediately after that phone call, the concession phone call, was to President Clinton. And he got President Clinton on the phone and said he wanted to thank him for everything that he had done. That seems like just kind of a nicety, but if you think about the Clinton-Obama relationship, it's kind of unthinkable. If you had thought, you'd never would have thought that a year earlier or 4 years earlier that they would ever be in that place. And it's kind of an extraordinary thing, and we've seen it play out now over the course of the year since then, where once these families, the Obamas and the Clintons, the kind of Hatfields and McCoys, the Montagues and the Capulets, they're now like really kind of married up in one big political family. Occasionally President Clinton will do something that annoys President Obama. His comment the other day about the Affordable Care Act was not particularly helpful. And yet, at the same time, we see President Obama inviting President Clinton to the White House and giving him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. When he gave him that medal, he thanked him for his advice both on and off the golf course. which we took note of. And even more recently, we saw President Obama inviting the Clintons out to Arlington Memorial Cemetery for the ceremony honoring, commemorating JFK's, the 50th anniversary of JFK's death. Again, not inviting Joe Biden to that ceremony, but instead bringing Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton along. Again, something that probably Joe Biden did not appreciate all that much. I'm going to stop, but I'll say one last thing about well, I know someone's going to want to ask about 2016, and we'll talk about that for sure. I mean, the biggest question in a lot of ways going forward for Hillary Clinton is what kind of role, if she runs for president, what kind of role Bill Clinton will play in her campaign. He has shown, certainly over the course of last year, that he still has his fastball. He's also shown, and you can see this in the pages of Double Down, that he is a very, very acute political pundit. There's a moment in the book in September or so of 2012 when Governor Romney's having a horrible time. He had just done the 47% video had just come out, and it was after the two conventions, the Republican convention very bad, the Democratic convention very good, President Obama kind of pulling ahead in the polls. And one of President Clinton's friends asked him what he thought of Governor Romney. And he said he thought he was a very nice man who was in the wrong line of work. He said he should not be speaking to people in public. Around the same time, someone asked President Clinton what he thought of President Obama at that point. And again, President Obama was getting all these lucky breaks, right? It was, he was just all this good fortune. The economy hadn't collapsed, and there hadn't been European financial crisis, and no hostilities in the Middle East. Everything seemed to be breaking President Obama's way. And President Clinton, summarizing that, said of President Obama, "He's luckier than a dog with two dicks." I spent the better part of a year trying to figure out what is so lucky about being a two-dick dog. But apparently for President Clinton, that is the luckiest thing you can be. I don't know why. As I said, I'm going to hand over to Mark now because I generally, when I get to the point where I'm talking about animal genitalia, generally a good time for me to move on. So thank you very much, and take it away.
Thank you all. Thanks to 92nd Street Y for hosting us in New York Magazine, and you all for coming out on a coldish Sunday night. New Yorkers like to listen to talk about politics, so we're glad to have you here. And I'm not going to talk for very long because, as John said, we do like to leave a lot of time for Q&A. As far as we're concerned, I know the cards are out there. Nothing's off limits. He asked questions about the details of the Ways and Means Committee's consideration of payroll tax cut or corporate tax reform, or the details of what John and I have learned on writing these two books, the details of the Clintons' marriage, whichever interests you more. All we'd ask, and again, I know some people have already filled out cards, but all we'd ask is all the questions be in the form of true, false. So as you're filling out the cards going forward, if you could do that, that'd be great. We like to tailor our talk a little bit for the audience. John said the thing about the dog when we spoke at the Clinton Library in Arkansas a few weeks ago, and oddly, when he told that line, no one laughed. So it was good to see people here think that was funny. But I want to do a quick survey, ask you to vote by show of hands. If you're comfortable voting in front of others, you can close your eyes as you vote. Raise your hand if you've read Double Down. Raise your hand. Okay, and raise your hand if you haven't read Double Down yet. Okay, I'm gonna shift up a little bit because I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but I am going to talk a little bit about two things. One is our process of how we go through and do these books in terms of telling the stories we tell, gathering the information, and then a little bit about what Double Down says about where we are now politically, particularly the president and the tough time he's having politically, as well as just a little bit about the Republicans in the book, some of whom we think will play some role in 2016. And then again, we'll go to your questions. Writing these books has been a great experience for us. We both have done political journalism for a long time, but the chance to do in-depth reporting, writing, and longer format about stories that we care a lot about, that we think are important to the country, has been a great experience. As was mentioned, the first book was made into a film by HBO. They have optioned this book. We're talking about, sort of how they would go about making a film out of this one. One big consideration, obviously, is how they would cast that dog character. Not necessarily an easy thing to do. But the books themselves are rewarding for a lot of reasons. First of all, we have both done this for a long time, and one of the challenges in political journalism today is to be able to cover both parties in presidential campaign, whether you've got an incumbent or not. You want to be able to cover the Democrats and Republicans, and it is unfortunate for the country and kind of an advantage for us that we're able to do pretty deep reporting with both parties, the president and the White House, and all the Republicans involved, the other Democratic players, because the story is not just about one party or the other, but it's the story of the people involved and the country's interest in both who the Democrats will nominate and who the Republicans nominate. We sort of framed things up in a way for this book exactly as we did for the first book and exactly as we conceived the first book before we'd started reporting or writing it or sold it to a publisher, which is we try to think about the big unanswered questions of the race. What are the things that, even with all the journalism that is done by us and others, minute by minute, hour by hour, day to day, week to week, month to month, there are questions that just don't get answered. In the last book, things like why Bill Clinton played the role he did in his wife's campaign, or why Barack Obama thought he could beat Hillary Clinton, how he decided to run, why John McCain ended up picking Sarah Palin as his running mate. All these are sort of big things that in the moment get a fair amount of scrutiny, but then the parade kind of moves on and the questions don't get answered. And we think they're pretty interesting questions if we pick the right ones, but also historically important. There's a sense in which we feel like if we didn't go out and try to get these answers, they may be lost to history because people's memories fade. People in the future, historians and other journalists, aren't going to have the same kind of relationship and access that we do. And so we go out and try to answer those. In this race, one of the big ones John talked about at some length, which was how did President Clinton and President Obama go from a very rough relationship at the end of the 2008 race to a much closer relationship by the time President Obama really needed him and began to court him. But there are a lot of other big questions. How did the Republican Party end up with Mitt Romney as their nominee when there was so much skepticism about him from the very beginning? And the things the skeptics said about him, going back to the immediate aftermath of the 2008 race when he'd done pretty poorly, but there was talk that he would run again, the very things people said about why he would be a weak candidate even if he ran a second time were the very things that played out when he did become the nominee. And so how did the party find itself in that place? That was a big question we answered. Some of the questions, like the two I just mentioned, clearly the answer to them and the events themselves had a huge impact on the outcome. There are other questions that may or may not have a huge impact or any impact at all on the outcome, but are just darn interesting, like how did the Republicans end up letting Clint Eastwood go on the stage at the last night of the Republican convention and do a monologue with a chair? Those things are, again, in the moment everybody wanted to know, how did that happen? And yet it wasn't really answered until we feel like we give a pretty full answer to that in the book. For this book, we did 500 interviews. That's a lot for any project, really, of any sort. But for a book that comes out a year after the election, it's a lot to get done. We do some during the campaign, but the bulk of them are after. Some people sometimes criticize us or are impatient with us over the course of from Election Day 2012 to Election Day 2013 when we published the book, and they say, why is it taking so long? You know, a year is a long time to wait in this day and age for a book about a president and a presidential campaign. We get that. We understand people's impatience. Sometimes if someone's really being insistent, we push back, not to be critical of someone who's a friend of ours, but we do like to point out that it took Doris Kearns Goodwin 100 years to do her Roosevelt book. So by that standard, I feel like we're going pretty fast. But it does take a lot of time to do those interviews. They're long interviews. They're with people at the top of the campaign all the way to the lower levels. And it's a lot of trying to figure out what's important, what's funny, as John said, dramatic, historically important, but also what tells the tale of the race. Not like a lot of political books. We're not writing about every primary or caucus or poll. We're trying to write about what it's like to run for president or be married to someone who runs for president, how people deal with the pressure of an intense competition where there's really only one winner and where the stakes for the country are extraordinarily high. We write in this book a lot about the president and the vice president, and about Bill Clinton, about the Republicans who did run, and a fair amount about the ones who didn't run, because that was a big story, a big part of the story of this race. So we do have a lot of people to cover, and to try to figure out how to allocate the space between them is one of the challenges we face. We always, when we're writing about anybody, we try to answer 3 questions at any given moment. What challenge is a certain whatever person we're writing about facing? How do they feel about it? And what do they do about it? The first and the third sometimes can be a matter of public record. We write often about what happened behind the scenes, about big events that are known. How did Governor Romney deal with the 47% video? But often we're writing about scenes that people don't know about. Some pretty dramatic scenes, for instance, involving the president as he prepared for the second debate against Governor Romney. One of, we think, the most important and dramatic moments in the book is the kind of the existential crisis the president faced, that his aides felt required an intervention with him just a day before that critical second debate. And the toughest part is that second question: how do people feel? Because getting close enough to presidential candidates today to answer that question, or at least make a stab at it, is quite difficult. Things have changed a lot in the 20 years or so that John and I have been doing this. We used to have a lot of access to candidates. Everybody in political journalism has less than they used to. The first candidate I covered full-time was Bill Clinton, 1991 and 1992, when he was running for president. We had a lot of access to Bill Clinton. We would see him in the hotel in the morning. We'd get on the bus with him. He'd talk to us on every rope line, on every flight. Really, there was no shortage of time with him. It got to the point during the campaign where at the end of the day, on the last flight of the day, often late at night, he would come to the back of the plane from his seat up front to talk to us, and we would literally pretend to be asleep because we had plenty of time with Bill Clinton. We wanted to talk amongst ourselves or do our expenses, whatever. Those days are kind of gone. First of all, no one turns down access to candidates, but it's rarely offered in that kind of intimate setting. Everybody has cell phone cameras, and there's Twitter, and there's a bad dynamic that's developed between the press, the political press, and most candidates, where they don't trust that we can keep things confidential, or even if it's something on the record that we will seize as a group, we'll seize on a gaffe or some controversy, rather than trying to use the opportunity to understand, again, how the candidates feel. So that, for us to do that and to pull that off in this day and age, requires 500 interviews, a lot of time with people. If you think about getting access to people in the Obama and Biden world, when the campaign started, they were running the government, and then they were both running the government and running for re-election, and then even after the election, they're all still pretty busy working on the second term. So it's a challenge to get the time of anybody involved, but particularly the people on the incumbent side. And we just work at it, and we're patient. We're not demanding the way sometimes reporters can be. We understand we're dealing with busy people, and we explain to them what the project is. All our interviews are only for the book. All the content is embargoed until the book comes out about a year after the election, in this case exactly a year. And that gives people the comfort level that they're willing to talk to us and tell us their stories. People like to tell their stories. Generally, it's a human trait, but also people want the stories, the accounts of the campaign like ours to be accurate. And they want to make sure that if we have a nuance wrong or a fact wrong, that we move towards getting it right. We are heartened by all the great reviews. As John said, probably the North Korean review is probably the one we're most appreciative of. But it's rare in writing a book that authors achieve exactly what they set out to do, and getting that endorsement has long been one of our goals. But there are two other pieces of feedback we often get that are quite heartening. One is from people who aren't political junkies, who don't normally read about politics in any form. But you know, when your book is reviewed in People magazine and Entertainment Weekly, as ours have been, sometimes you get the attention of people who aren't that into politics. And sometimes people say to us about the books, love the book. Really, it's not a book about politics, it's a book about people and relationships, and that's how we view it, and that's heartening. The other really heartening thing is when people involved, either in this campaign particularly, or just political veterans, say to us, you all nailed it. You all describe what it's like within a campaign, the feel of it, the smell of it, the pace of it, the pressure of it. And that's really, as much as anything, what we're trying to do. We're not trying to write, as I said before, a definitive account of every primary and caucus. We're trying to tell the story from a human point of view of what happens, and that's what drives the books. I just want to talk second now just a little bit about what Double Down tells us about where we are and where we might be going in our politics. The president now is struggling. He's had a pretty bad year politically, and the health care rollout has obviously been a big part of that, but also trying to gain some momentum into a second term, even though Republicans still control the House. You know, the president's approval rating is down. A lot of his poll numbers across the board are down. John mentioned the period in the fall of 2011 when the President Obama's political situation looked pretty rough, and he reached out to President Clinton. That was a rough period. It's now, though, referred to the White House as the good old days, because the position he's in now is quite perilous. And so the question naturally arises, is any of what's happening now the product of how he ran for re-election? And I think the answer is a large extent yes. The president had a theory of the case, which was he could spend the last year of his first term from the fall of 2011 through Election Day just trying to beat up the Republicans, beat up Mitt Romney when he became the nominee, to convince the public that he was entitled to a mandate simply because he had won the election. The phrase he used in public and private was, after the election, the fever will break. And he would have a second chance to try to bring Washington together, bring the country together. He's not been able to do that, I think in part because he did spend a year beating up the Republicans and Governor Romney, and they didn't take particularly kindly to that. But in addition, he didn't really run in a way to get a mandate for the things he wanted to do, including implementing health care. The scene I mentioned before, the so-called intervention on the eve of the second debate, where the president is really grappling with how he can perform better in that format than he had in Denver in the first face-off with Governor Romney. And part of the president's problem was about performance. He doesn't like the artificiality, the theatricality of debates. But also, as he said in that session with his aides, he didn't feel he had a robust second-term agenda. He didn't feel he was running on big things the way he had in 2008. And therefore, it was hard for him to kind of explain in the debates what his re-election was really about, to be kind of energized about fighting for a second term as much as he felt he would be better for the country than Governor Romney. That was one problem. Another problem, not his fault, and probably helped him get reelected, but again, I think has set him up in a rough place now, is the fact that Governor Romney was the Republican nominee. Governor Romney, who had passed his own health care law in Massachusetts with an individual mandate. As many Republicans said about him, he wouldn't be able to make the case for health care against Obamacare and for a different kind of health care reform because he was so politically damaged, not just within his own party, but with the public perception of him because of what he passed. And so we did not have a robust debate as a country in this last election about what the implementation would mean, whether it was on track. And neither candidate wanted to have that, and so we didn't. And I think that's really put the president in a rough place because there's not too much he can point to of things he said during the re-election campaign about health care that he could rely on to say that he's entitled to a mandate. The president does face a tough clock here now because we've got the midterm elections coming up in less than a year. We've got a Republican Party that's pretty emboldened now and not inclined to give the president wins on anything. And you still have within the Republican Party a divided House of Representatives, but one where it would take a lot to move through on the president's big priorities: immigration reform, climate change, minimum wage. It'd take a lot to get that done. It's possible. You know, I like to be optimistic, and I think it's good for the country, whatever political party you're in, for the president to not have a 4-year term where, at least on the domestic front, basically nothing happens. So I hope he can turn it around. We'll see. It does lead, though, to a lot of speculation about what happens next. As John said, the Clintons and the Obamas are now fused into one political family. It does leave Joe Biden as kind of the odd man out. One of the things we report in the book, it's gotten some attention, is that in the fall of 2011, that same rough period, the president's top aides looked at the question of whether it would be politically beneficial to replace Joe Biden on the ticket with Hillary Clinton. Since the book has come out, that's, we understand, caused a little scratchiness in the White House, and the Vice President's not too pleased about that. It's particularly uncomfortable because of the close relationship between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, both back to their Senate days, even before she was in the Senate, but from the Senate forward, and when she was Secretary of State and he was Vice President, they're extraordinarily close, and really close, not just the way people in politics say they're close. They often, as we reported in Game Change, will end their phone conversations saying, "I love you," to each other. That is very rare in politics. Like, not even the Cheney sisters do that. I will tell you, one of the life lessons I've learned is you cannot go wrong telling a Cheney joke at the 92nd Street Y. So I've been eagerly awaiting that moment. So the vice president, like everybody else in the Democratic Party, is just going to have to sit and wait to see if Hillary Clinton runs, and if she does, John and I both think she'll largely clear the field. People like the vice president and others who would otherwise be inclined to take a look at it will take a pass, we think, because she's so formidable. She has almost every advantage of incumbency without having to run the federal government. There are some challenges for her. She needs a message. She needs a way to think about staffing a campaign better than she did last time, but she is formidable. On the Republican side, one of the things about Double Down, not by design, but just the way it's worked out, is there's a lot of people we write about in the book who are certain to be at least talked about as big players in the next campaign, and at least some of them will run. Governor Christie is a huge character in Double Down, a fascinating guy who we learned a lot about in reporting the book in terms of all the roles he played in this last campaign, where he was almost a candidate himself for president. His endorsement for Governor Romney was a huge deal. He was almost put on the ticket, keynote speaker at the convention, and then at the end of the campaign, when his physical and literal embrace of President Obama in the aftermath of Sandy got him in hot water with Republicans and led some people close to Governor Romney to believe that that was a pretty decisive moment towards the end of the campaign. There's also people like Mike Huckabee, who we write about because he didn't run in 2012, but may well run next time. Rick Santorum will likely run again. John Huntsman, Paul Ryan, Jeb Bush. It is likely to be maybe even a bigger field than last time, likely to be of a higher quality overall than the field last time. That wasn't meant to be funny, but thank you for laughing. And the Republican Party is going to, it appears, have the same challenge they had in the last cycle, which is how do they find a nominee who can not only unite the establishment wing of the Republican Party, which traditionally has picked the nominee, with the Tea Party wing of the party, the more populist grassroots, but also appeal to Democrats and independents, and included in those latter two groups, the so-called members of the coalition of the ascendant, which really was the way President Obama got reelected, to the surprise of some, younger people, African Americans, Hispanics, single women, gay, lesbian. These groups are all growing in political influence and demographically, and yet the Republican Party has not found a way as a national party to find a message to appeal to those groups sufficiently to give them a very good chance in the abstract. Now, of course, it's not done in the abstract, and they'll have to find a candidate who can do it rather than as a party. And Hillary Clinton is formidable with all those groups. On the other hand, just as she freezes the Democratic side of the field until she makes a decision, I don't think you'll see too many Democrats out there aggressively doing anything. The Republican Party has to assume now, unless Hillary Clinton decides not to run, that they need a nominee who can take on Hillary Clinton. And that means someone who is a formidable fundraiser, someone who is politically tough and sophisticated, someone who has the capacity to take on not just Hillary Clinton, but Bill Clinton. That's a pretty tall order. And so a lot of the names you hear bandied about now of people who are thinking about running at least, I think would come up short in the eyes of a lot of Republicans and the eyes of a lot of handicappers, because it's going to be difficult, just as it was very difficult to take on Barack Obama, as Mitt Romney found, even though he was a prodigious fundraiser. We write about in Double Down all the ways he fell short. I think it's going to be difficult for the Republicans, if Hillary Clinton runs, to find someone to match up with her. I'm going to stop there in part because I want to make sure we leave enough time for the Q&A, and also because that is the longest I've spoken on the book tour without somebody yelling out, "You lie," which always throws me off, so I'm glad I got done before that happened. Thank you again for coming, and now we're both going to take whatever questions you have. Thank you.
All right, let's see what we've got here.
Are you memorizing and then doubling back to the best ones, or you don't like any of these so far? Problematic.
Actually, I'm going to start with this one. They're all brilliant, all of them, and we're going to answer every last one of them. I'm going to start with this one, though. To Mark.
Oh, okay.
When will the page come back online?
Mom, listen. The page is a website that I've done for time.com, and I've been on book leave and now book tour, so thank you, that one person who reads my website, and maybe I'll just email you my thoughts and cut out the middleman. It'll be back. I'm getting ready to come off the book tour, so stay tuned.
Okay. I'm just going to read these, all right?
Well, you read one, and then I'll take the stack from you while you answer. How about that?
You want to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I want to touch and feel the card.
There's the stack. You go. Okay. Will the Tea Party voters stay home if one of their own is not on the ticket in 2016? If one is on the ticket, does that help or hurt the Democrats? Well, it's interesting. The Tea Party is obviously a new phenomenon, right? So we have only one presidential election's worth of experience with their voting behavior in a presidential cycle, which is 2012. I think Mark and I both agree that the Tea Party was stronger in 2012 than it will be in 2016, coming out of its ascendance and its huge success in the 2010 midterms. It was as strong a political force as there was in America, and yet in the Republican Party, the Tea Party did not choose the nominee. Mitt Romney was not beloved by the Tea Party by any means. His biggest problem in some sense was that he was neither beloved by the Tea Party nor by the establishment wing. He was kind of a man without a country in the Republican Party. But the Tea Party didn't hold veto power over the Republican nominee in the Republican Party. So its strength was relatively limited even in the election when it had the greatest possible strength. You know, from what we could tell from exit polls, which are an imperfect mechanism, Tea Party voters, even though they didn't like Mitt Romney very much, still turned out for him in pretty large numbers in the 2012 election. They were motivated, I think, not almost exclusively, but largely, if not not exclusively, by animus towards President Obama. I imagine that to the extent that the Tea Party is still an extant force in 2016, they will be animated largely by making sure Democrats do not maintain control of the White House for a third successive term. And so, to the extent that they are relevant, I think they will probably turn out for whoever the Republican nominee is, unless that person is so far to the left that the person would have to be so far to the left that it would be hard to imagine that person getting the Republican nomination. So I think the Tea Party, I think, is becoming pretty well integrated. Is becoming a lesser force, but is becoming pretty much a standard chunk of the Republican coalition at this point. And I think by and large, what we've seen in the past, whether it was the religious right or other groups that came in from the outside to infiltrate the Republican coalition, they became routinized members of the Republican coalition and pretty much regular Republican voters. I imagine that same thing will be true of this group.
I like an event where I get to pick my own questions. This is awesome.
Okay.
So here's the question I'm going to answer. The question is, who would you identify as a 2016 presidential candidate who has not yet gotten national press coverage? Excellent question. And because I'm going to give some names that have gotten a little bit of speculation, because it's hard in this day and age with the internet and Twitter to come up with people who've not been mentioned at all. But I'm going to give you two in each party that have been kind of under-mentioned as far as I'm concerned. On the Democratic side, as I say, I think Hillary Clinton will probably run, but I don't think, and John agrees, I know, it's a sure thing as some do. But if she doesn't run, the Democratic race becomes wide open. I've been struck in talking to Democrats in Washington around the country how relatively little enthusiasm there is for Vice President Biden as a candidate. I think he probably would run, but he would face a pretty tough road in fundraising and everything else. So I'll give you two names of people I think will take a hard look at it if she doesn't run. One is John Kerry, who I think, on the strength of his speech at the last Democratic convention and his role so far as Secretary of State, I think he'd be inclined to take a look at it. And the other, because the country's in desperate need of change and a new generation of leadership, I think Jerry Brown would look at running. And I'm not kidding about that. He's got to decide whether he wants to run for re-election. But Governor of California, he's run for president before. He and John Kerry would both be subject to the James Carville adage that running for president's like having sex. You don't just do it once and then say, that was all right. I'm done with that. I'm moving on. So I think on the Democratic side, those are two possibilities. On the Republican side, I think he's gotten attention in the last couple days and spoke out, but I think is undercovered as a potential force is Mike Huckabee, who, as I said, ran or as everyone knows, ran in 8, passed for 12, but I think might well run. On the Republican side, you've got a field that I think is dominated right now by Governor Huckabee and then 3 more establishment candidates, would-be candidates. Governor Bush, Jeb Bush of Florida, I think will probably pass for personal reasons, but he could run. Paul Ryan, same thing. I think he might decide his kids are still too young and pass. That leaves Governor Christie. Possible he'll decide he wants to really focus the balance of his second term in New Jersey on transportation and other issues. because those can be thorny. But it's possible that all three of them will take a pass for one reason or another. And if that happens, again, this one, you might think this one is meant to be a joke, but it's really not. If those three guys all passed and no one else emerged as a strong establishment candidate, I could see Governor Romney making another run at it. Yes. And I guess not a lot of you would be writing checks for that campaign. But, there are people around him who have talked about the fact that the field does look weak to them, depending on who runs, and that he is a formidable fundraiser, and that he's got the experience of having run and learned largely how not to do it. So we will see. But I think at least Governor Christie will probably run. And I think that would be enough to keep Governor Romney out of the race.
A very nice man in the wrong line of work.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a big question. What do you think the long historical view of President Obama's presidency will be? Certainly not a true-false question. I think that we like to often cite our favorite political philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. So I don't like to really get into the prediction business, but I think it's hard to know. The president still has 3 years to go, the three out of 8. So there's still a lot of time for him to do big things, despite the difficulties that he finds himself in right now. I would have been, if you had asked me a year ago, I would have said that, that a lot of the big things the president did in the first term, how those things played out over the years would have a big effect. First, him winning re-election, it seemed to me, was really essential. Had he lost, I think he would have, in fact, been regarded by many as a failed one-term kind of accident of history. Having won re-election, the implementation of, and how the big laws that he passed in the first term, how those laws play out, and it's impossible to judge them now, but how those things play out will, I think, determine what history's view of him is. He will always have, obviously, this big place in American history as the first African-American president. There's no doubt about that. But that is a hugely important moment for our country, but you can't really earn greatness as a president on that metric alone. And I think more than I would have said a year ago, now it seems to me that the long view of President Obama's presidency is going to be defined to an extraordinarily large degree by what happens with health care law. And I would have said that a year ago or 2 years ago that was a big deal. It's now a much, much bigger deal, I think, given the disastrous nature of the rollout and how much it seems to me the law's success has been imperiled by not just the bulky website, although that is a huge problem and one that cannot be underestimated or should not be underestimated. How important it is for the level of infrastructural. To have a law of this size and scope and sweep and as complicated a market as the healthcare market, the infrastructure piece is crucial. And if the infrastructure piece does not work, the technological infrastructure piece, the law will not succeed. If the law fails, and this is seen as a debacle, and to me, I will say, it's perfectly possible. I'm a big fan of universal health care as a goal. I think it's has long been a scandal that America doesn't have universal health care. In principle, I was in favor of the president pursuing it, but if this thing does not, I think there's a reasonable chance that it will fail. I think there's a reasonable chance it will succeed, but right now I don't think it's better than 50-50. And if the law fails, it is such a big thing for the president now that it will be the first thing on his the long political obituary for him will be. When he dies, this was for the president who achieved this extraordinarily important democratic goal and then either made it work or failed. And so a lot rests in the balance of what happens. And I think over the next 6 months or 9 months, we're going to know the answer to that question. It'll be a lot easier to answer the question on the card this time next year than it is today.
What you said, and one of the things I read here reminded me of something I meant to say about Governor Romney. Another reason the people around him think he would be a strong candidate is he thinks he was right about a lot of things, that the country will have buyer's remorse about the president, including on health care, although he didn't make a big issue of it, as I said. But it is certainly the case that the Republican nomination fight, whoever runs, will be dominated to a large extent by discussion of sort of all the things the president did wrong in the view of Republicans, and Governor Romney would feel like he could talk about that with some authority. The questions really are excellent. I thought you were kidding, but they really are excellent. But
I wasn't kidding.
I know.
I wasn't. Not joking.
Here's
nothing less than I would expect
Yes.
from this august group.
Yes. So I'm going to go to a question here about Congress that I think is a really good one and important one. Might John Boehner's strong rebuke to the extreme right of his party be the start of a less toxic and more cooperative atmosphere in the House? I'm sure everybody here, because you all follow the news, knows that John Boehner spoke out on 2 successive days last week against Republican groups, conservative groups, who were critical of the budget agreement that was passed passed the House and likely passed the Senate through that deal between Democratic Senator Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, the Republican Congress budget chairman. I think John Boehner is really an underrated leader and is often caricatured. Sometimes his propensity to cry and the orangish skin dominates the coverage of him. But he's a really thoughtful guy and has known since the Tea Party swept him into the speakership that it would be difficult to lead a party with so many younger members and new members who are more inclined to metaphorically burn the place down than they are to strike the kind of compromises that are essential now, as long as we have a Democrat in the White House and a Republican speaker. I think if John Boehner keeps this up, what he did last week could end up being an historic moment, not just in terms of the potential relationship between the parties, but also the direction of the Republican Party. As long as we have divided government, what happened last week, that deal is going to have to be a model for anything getting done. And you often will see in political coverage discussions of legislative strategy and sort of the kind of direction that one or both parties are likely to head, framed as, well, what's good for them politically? What's good for the next election? John Boehner, like the president, is willing to deal with the consequences of the next election, even if they're adverse to their party, if there's something that can be done that they think is important. And I think what the Republicans have needed for themselves politically for a while, and they needed it in the last election, and Governor Romney didn't perform this task, is to do what Bill Clinton did for the Democratic Party in 1990 and 91 and 92. You recall Bill Clinton, when he put himself forward to be the Democratic nominee, supported a range of positions that were absolutely out of step with the what was then the mainstream of the Democratic Party. He supported free trade and the NAFTA agreement. He supported the death penalty. He supported right-to-work laws. He spoke about abortion rights in a slightly different way. He supported welfare reform. And all those things rubbed some people in the party the wrong way, including labor unions, for instance, on trade. And Bill Clinton was politically skillful enough and strong enough to say, I like labor unions, I'm not against unions, but we do need some changes in our party and in the country. And I think while Speaker Boehner's critique of those groups did not go as deep as Bill Clinton's broad-based critique, simply speaking out against the powerful interest groups of his party, saying that they were wrong-headed and in effect saying they're extreme, is something that's just not done very much by anybody in the Republican Party, and certainly not by the conservative Speaker of the House. So I think, again, if he keeps it up, if others join with him, I think it may end up being one of the biggest things that's happened politically in this year and could transform the debates in Washington for a good long while.
I'm gonna put I have 2 questions here that I'm gonna put together and answer as one. We get asked this question all the time, and I always find it kind of funny. The first one is a generic question: what is the best anecdote that you could not include in the book? And then there's a second question, which is related: is there a Sarah Palin story that didn't make it into the book that you can share? The reason I find this question funny is that if you kind of just think it through, we try to put really interesting things in the book, but they have to be true. And if we're satisfied that they're true, we put them in the book because that's kind of what we're all about. So, as a general matter, if the anecdote is a good anecdote and it's true, it's probably in the book. So if to answer the first question, what is the best anecdote you could not include in the book? We have all the good anecdotes are in the book. All the ones that were either fantastic but were not true, or boring, we left out. So that's the first answer. Is there a Sarah Palin story that didn't make it in the book that you could share? As I said, can you imagine us leaving a really good Sarah Palin story out of the first book? I'm not sure what this person was thinking, but having said both those things, I will tell one story from the first book, which actually violates my first answer to the first question, which is there actually was one great anecdote that we could not figure out a way to get into the first book that I'm always regretful we couldn't figure it out. There's no way to fit it in. It made no sense, but I still find it very funny. And it's a story about John McCain being on a trip to Michigan, being in a hotel, and being informed by one of his aides that Clint Eastwood, who of course plays a big role in Double Down, as Mark mentioned earlier, that Clint Eastwood was in the hotel. He was in Michigan at that point filming the movie Gran Torino. And Eastwood revered McCain, and McCain revered Eastwood. And this aide said, Clint would like to come up and say hello. And McCain was delighted and said, that's fantastic, bring him up. So Clint Eastwood comes upstairs and sits with McCain, and they have a lovely time. They chat, they talk, the signatures, exchange of cell phone numbers, whatever. And Eastwood leaves. And one of McCain's aides said to him, God, Clint Eastwood, man, wasn't that great? That was totally awesome. He came up here, and this is fantastic, right? And McCain says, yeah, God, it was just great to meet Clint Eastwood, but boy, does he look old.
Okay. Do you tend to cast your key sources in a positive light, as Beckdor thanks for their time? We do get asked that a fair amount. 500 interviews, almost all of which are at least an hour, and some are substantially longer. We have a lot of key sources, and there are plenty of people who talk to us at great length for the book who are not particularly delighted with their portrayal in the book. The book's accurate, and I think most people, even if they don't love every word of the book that's written about them, at least grudgingly accept that what we've written is accurate. And since most of them care about history, the vast majority do, we don't get too much hear too very often in either book from anybody who's unhappy. But the notion that we would give people who cooperated with us better coverage just isn't true. It'd be a dereliction of what we're supposed to do as journalists. But also, we really succeed in our effort to speak to everybody involved in a given situation. So I would consider if there's a scene where one person might come at better than the other, and we've talked to both of them, I'd consider them both to be key sources. And so, again, we wouldn't be giving anyone better coverage because of their level of cooperation, but rather just the facts of what actually happened. And we take that extraordinarily seriously. In the case of Governor Palin, for instance, some of her supporters said we wrote our accounts of her in Game Change based on people who didn't like her, people with sour grapes or axes to grind. Many of the people we interviewed for that book about Governor Palin, and many of the people we interviewed in this book about other people in Double Down, are people who very much like Governor Palin, liked her then, like her now, and that doesn't mean that their accounts weren't part of what we wrote. To the contrary, they were a big part of what we wrote, and sometimes their accounts were not necessarily things Governor Palin was happy about, either that they actually happened or that they appear in the book. But again, our responsibility is to evaluate the sources and to include their material based on a search for the truth of what happened, getting the facts right and the feel right, and we do that regardless of who's cooperated and to what extent. Sorry about that. Held those hostage.
No problem. Well, I'm just reading the first one off the list. I'm not sorting anymore. They're all so good that just start from the top. What are the chances the Democratic Party will be elected to the White House in the next presidential election? Well, I would say that it's very unusual for a given party to hold the White House for 3 terms consecutively. Historically, it has happened only rarely. So that big historic precedent would suggest that probably after 2 years of Democrats in the White House, that the country will be very open to looking for a Republican. That said, and President Obama's term has been, I don't think there's a way you will get to the end of this 8-year term and be able to say that the economic performance of the country over the course of these 8 years has been stellar, the kind of economy that a Democrat, whoever that Democrat was, would be able to run on as kind of a, you must reelect Democrats because we've given you so much prosperity that to break from Democratic policies would be too dangerous. So you'll have likely, a recovering but still relatively tepid economy. and not the economy not performing at a level that most Americans want it to. And so again, that will create an opening for Republicans. Having said that, you have two big problems, and we've kind of addressed both of them in various ways in the course of this conversation. One is that the stature of Secretary Clinton, if she runs, it is hard. There are Republicans who could beat her, but she really is a much larger figure in every sense than anybody currently contemplating running on the Republican side. Again, there are probably some Republicans who could beat her, but there's a stature gap that we head into this race with. She is an extraordinarily popular figure. She's also, there is, I think, a feeling among many people in the country, Democrats and Republicans alike, that having now had an African-American president, it is time for a woman to be president of the United States. And that will be a big force for why she will be a formidable contender for the Democratic nomination. But I think it would be part of why she would be a formidable general election candidate. And the other thing that we both talked about in different ways is that the Republican Party really still, the Republican Party is a very successful congressional governing party in the sense that I don't see any likelihood the Republicans are not going to control the House after 2014. And I think the Republicans could continue to control the House for a long time into the future. Republicans may gain the Senate in 2014. The way that the maps have been drawn and the way that state-by-state politics work and district-by-district politics work, Republicans could continue to be a strong congressional party for a long time. But the big problems that the Republican Party has with the national electorate, as Mark indicated before, the party's done nothing in the last year to remedy those problems. And it's hard to imagine, I mean, it's not impossible to imagine, but again, right now, I don't see a Republican who is an obvious solution to the Republican Party's desperate problems with Latino voters, with single women, with African Americans, with other minorities. They have a huge problem with the demography of the country that the party, as I said a second ago, has not done anything to make better over the last year, and in some ways has made worse. So those two things, the stature gap if Secretary Clinton does run, and her various strengths, and the weakness of the Republican Party as a national governing party, and no obvious Republican who's a transformative figure, someone who right now looks like what Bill Clinton was in 1990-91, suggests to me that it's quite possible, if Hillary Clinton is the nominee, that she will be able to defy historic precedent and a tepid economy and still gain the White House for Democrats in 2016.
Okay, this is an interesting question. How ideal a holiday gift does Double Down make for everyone on our list? I may have misread it. Sorry.
The answer to that one, though, is very.
We're going to answer a few more, and then we are going to be outside signing books for those who are interested. Question actually is, what is the one reform you would want to see based on the last two elections and your observations? I think one of the things you see in both books is that politicians running for president, like normal human beings, make a lot of their mistakes when they're really tired. And I think they're ill-served by being so tired because they can't perform as well. But I think the country's ill-served because they don't have as much time to rest and think about issues, think about the conduct of their own campaigns, not just in terms of whether they're winning the day or not, or performing well in a debate, but preparing to govern in a way that would maximize the chances that they could going from being a candidate to being in the White House. So the biggest thing that chews up time is raising money. And there's a variety of ways that you could think about a reform, a legal reform, a law passed that would make it easier for them to not have to raise as much money. I think most of those are unlikely to succeed, unlikely to pass, public financing being the one that gets talked about the most. I would like to see reforms, and again, these can be done not with laws, but just by candidates. If you can harness new media, if you're willing to do a lot of interviews and other public appearances that get your message out, and if you're good at that, you don't need to raise so much money. All the money, almost every dollar that's raised, goes for 30-second TV ads. And the candidates feel they have to have that. And there's obviously historical reasons they think that. You see often presidential campaigns nominating fights as well as general elections decided by how much TV time is bought. But I'd like to see candidates insist on time to rest, take away time from fundraising, and if it means they have less money to spend on 30-second ads, I'd like them to find creative ways to make that up that wouldn't tie them down to spending so much time flying around the country meeting pardon if I offend anyone here, with rich people, asking them for money, rather than doing all the other things they should be doing, I think, to be better candidates and potentially better presidents.
Another excellent question is, what do you think Barack Obama is going to do in his post-presidency? Is he going to become a serious philanthropist? Will he take some aides with him and set up a foundation? Well, certainly there will be a Barack Obama post-presidential foundation. It seems every president now has one. It's kind of like the must-have thing for modern presidents. The question is kind of what those foundations do and how active they are and how much fundraising they do, how ambitious their agendas are. But he will have something of that kind. There's a lot of discussion about it currently in Chicago, where we were not that long ago. And there's going to be an intense competition for the site of what will be the Barack Obama Presidential Library and perhaps, I think, quite likely a foundation. There are a bunch of different places in and around Chicago that would like to see that happen there. Hawaii is going to try, I'm sure, to find a site and get involved in that competition. I think the likelihood that it will be somewhere on the south side of Chicago is very, very high, both because of President Obama's connection to the University of Chicago, but also because, as someone pointed out to us when we were there, the economic development implications of such an institution would be huge. And on the south side of Chicago, which is a place that the president cares a lot about, and where economic opportunity is still too scarce, the number of jobs and tourism that it would bring would revitalize that neighborhood in a way that almost nothing else ever would. And I think the president will see that as a huge attraction to deciding to put his footprint back there. And I think it's a little hard to know exactly what his post-presidency will look like, and how ambitious he'll be, whether he'll be more in the Bill Clinton model or more in the George W. Bush model. I tend to think he'll be more in the George W. Bush model, and by that I don't mean doing pictures, paintings of himself in the bathtub, but perhaps less globe-trotting than Bill Clinton. The one thing I think is certain, though, is that he will set himself to writing a memoir relatively quickly after he leaves the White House. And I think, almost uniquely among former presidents in our lives, he has it within him the capacity to write a genuinely great book. There are not that many presidents who are actual real writers with his literary gifts. He may or may not get there and do it that well, but I think he will take it very seriously and will not try to do a clip job or a rush job like President Clinton did. I think he will probably sit with it for some years and try to produce a memoir that is both a valuable artifact for history, but also a really just kind of a great piece of writing. I think that really matters to him a lot, and he'll put his mind to that.
More on the Doris Kearns Goodwin pace than the Heilemann Halperin pace.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a good question about a couple of Republicans who people talk about as presidential candidates, who I don't think we've mentioned, or at least not in any great detail. The first question is, A, is Scott Walker ready for prime time, governor of Wisconsin? B, is Mike Pence, the governor of Indiana, the real GOP dork horse for 2016? No and yes. Thank you very much. I think Scott Walker is a very impressive guy, and it seemed pretty clear he's got a book out. He's thinking about doing it. I think it'd be very challenging for someone to go from the governor of that state without a lot of national ties or national experience to be a strong presidential candidate. If the field lines up in a certain way, I think he could be a part of the process. But I have found that it's a big leap to go from being a governor of a state to national politics. He's not been on the national scene very long. And if you look at people who've succeeded, they tend to have been part of the national conversation. Bill Clinton was governor of a small southern state, but he'd been part of the national conversation for a couple decades, and also, of course, as a politician of a lifetime. So it's not clear to me that Governor Walker's ready to step up, and since John used about 7 sports metaphors, I'll use one, that he could hit major league pitching the first time around. But again, if the field lines up in a certain way, I think he could be certainly part of the conversation. Governor Pence is a really impressive guy, and is from the conservative wing of the party. Thought about, instead of running, he was a congressman, thought about instead of running for governor, running for president last time, but instead ran for governor and has had a pretty decent record there so far. He definitely would like to be president someday. He is a Republican who gets along well with the national media, which is helpful. if you want to get elected president for whatever reason, that seems to matter. And he has great support in the grassroots. Whether he could be a strong establishment candidate, raising money in places like Manhattan, I'm not sure. And I think, again, history suggests that that's a pretty important part of deciding who gets the nomination. But I think if you ask me between these two guys, Scott Walker, who gets talked about a lot, Mike Pence, who gets talked about less, if you ask me who's more likely to be a player in 2016, I think Mike Pence is more likely.
All right, now a more personal question. How are you received in D.C.? Are people typically cautious of talking to you casually? Has anyone tried to run you over in their car? No, I added that part. I'd say about half the people in Washington greet us with smiles, handshakes, and hugs, and about half actually do try to run us over in their cars. I'm kidding. We love D.C. Almost as much as we love New York, and we spend a lot of time there. We've both been doing this for a long time, especially shuttling back and forth between New York and Washington. One of the kind of misconceptions about Game Change and Double Down is that the people somehow that the books, because sometimes they have created controversy, that the people who have read them, the people who are sources for them, somehow have some weird feeling about them. I mean, it is certain that there have been some. Most of both these books are written almost exclusively about the candidates and their spouses. Do I think that John Edwards was totally psyched about the portrayal of him in Game Change? I do not. But most of the people that we deal with, elected officials, strategists, tacticians, aides, others in Washington, D.C. The reason that we do 500 interviews with 400 people, and the reason that people spend hours with us, these interviews are not short interviews, they're long interviews. We sit with people for sometimes 2, 3, 4 hours. There was one source for this last book that we spent 3 days with, doing 12 hours of interviews a day for over a long weekend. The reason that people spend that time with us is because we come to the interviews really well prepared. We are very respectful of their time, and we take the interviews very seriously. And we let people tell their stories. And as Mark said, people love to tell their stories. And people who have been in campaigns, who feel as though the activity they were involved in is one of the most intense professional and personal experiences they've ever had, and that it was part of history, whether their candidate won or lost. Those people are generally, they're in some ways grateful to have two people who take what they do really seriously and treat them with great respect. And I think, by and large, because of the fact that we are very scrupulous about observing the ground rules that we set when we talk to the sources that we talk to, and for the reasons that Mark suggested, that we hope that these books, and we hear from a fair number of people that the books do kind of capture what it feels like to be involved in these efforts. People generally read the books and think, yeah, that's what happened, and I was treated fairly. And so we have very little controversial or contentious relationships in the periods after the first book, and it's a little too early to tell on this one, but I don't think there'll be any different. There will be any difference going forward. But we went from 300 interviews with 200 people in the first book to 500 interviews with 400 people in this book. If we do another book, I'm afraid we may be doing like 1,000 interviews with 800 people, which will kill us both. But we've not lacked for people who've been willing to sit down, and we hope that'll continue.
John may have overstated at least my delight with Washington, D.C. There's a reason why we cover national politics, and John lives in Brooklyn. I live on the Upper West Side. I tend to agree with what President Kennedy said about Washington, which is it's a city of northern charm and southern efficiency. And I am going there 3 times this week, but that's just a coincidence.
Yes.
All right, unless someone objects, I think this is the last question. And it's about Governor Christie. And the question is, how does Governor Christie actually survive to win the 2016 Republican primaries and nomination? Does he skip Iowa? How does he make it to Super Tuesday intact? There's a lot of talk about Governor Christie when people think of him as a potential presidential candidate about whether he's too moderate to be nominated. I actually don't think he's all that moderate. And again, if you think about his issue positions vis-a-vis the Republican orthodoxy compared to Bill Clinton's in '92, I think Governor Christie's in a lot safer terrain on that score. And on the calendar, could he skip Iowa as John McCain did to win the nomination? Could he figure out a way to get through some of the more conservative states? I think he could, but I'm not sure that he has to. I think his personality, if he manages his public image right, I think could play well in almost every state in the union in the Republican nomination fight. I think the bigger question for Governor Christie is about temperament and dealing with controversy. We write in Double Down about the vetting report, the background look that Governor Romney's team did on Governor Christie. And there were things in there that Governor Christie has said since the book came out he sure will be controversial if he decides to run for president. Will get a lot of scrutiny. Most of these things have been part of the public record. One of Governor Romney's advisors, who also advises Governor Christie, said during the vice presidential selection process to Governor Romney, look, these things have all been looked at in New Jersey. And Governor Romney said, doesn't matter. Things that are big deals or get some scrutiny at the state level totally change complexion and potentially velocity if you're put on the ticket as a running mate or if you run for president yourself. So, you know, one of those things is Governor Christie, for a time, worked as a lobbyist. Not a lot of people know he did that. One of the organizations he lobbied for at the time he was a lobbyist was a securities organization who at the time, Governor Christie was their lobbyist, was headed by Bernie Madoff.
Wait. Not the Bernie Madoff.
No, yes, the Bernie Madoff. Okay. Yes, the Bernie Madoff.
That's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, as one of the researchers looking at Governor Christie's background for Governor Romney said, that is a 30-second commercial that writes itself. So that's one issue. When he was the U.S. attorney, there was an inspector general's investigation done at the Justice Department into the spending practices of U.S. attorneys. Governor Christie was found to be the most wasteful spender of all the U.S. attorneys in terms of staying in fancy hotels during travel. Things like that, which may amount to nothing. But when you're under the glare of a presidential campaign, how you handle these things matter. On the day Governor Romney got the final vetting report about Governor Christie, after which he decided he wasn't going to pick him as his running mate, they also gave him a DVD of kind of Governor Christie's greatest hits. A lot of you have seen these things of him blowing up his constituents. One of them, particularly memorable, was Governor Christie having a fight with a constituent on a boardwalk on the Jersey Shore, and the constituent decides he's had enough and starts to walk away. And Governor Christie not only goes after him and continues to scream at him, but is holding and brandishing an ice cream cone as if it's kind of like a weapon. Now, the American people may decide that's not the most presidential act they've ever seen. And if Governor Christie runs, the stuff in our book, and I'm sure a bunch of other stuff, the stuff at the George Washington Bridge, it's all going to be looked at. And how you handle that on the road with a national press corps, the Jersey press corps is pretty tough, and they're pretty tough on him. But how he handled that on 8 press conferences a day in New Hampshire, how he handles that with donors, whether people find his volcanic reaction, which he has on occasion, to be presidential, I think that will be a big part of whether if he runs, whether he gets through, more than whether he's conservative enough, more than whether he can play well in Dubuque. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.